Hi everyone, my name is Jesse Toufexis, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 10th episode of Meet the Author, presented by the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. Our featured author today is actually a book collector in this case, Gerald Stone, who is joining us to discuss his impressive and award-winning volume entitled Catalog of the Gerald K. Stone Collection, a bibliographical resource for Canadian Jewish Studies. Before I tell you more about Gerald and introduce our special guest interviewer, Michelle Margolis Chesner, a few words about the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies. The Association for Canadian Jewish Studies is the only academic society dedicated solely to the study of the Canadian Jewish experience. Our organization is multidisciplinary and we encourage interdisciplinarity. We publish the annual journal Canadian Jewish Studies, Études Juives Canadiennes. We also publish a newsletter twice a year and hold an annual conference. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we canceled our 2020 conference and decided to inaugurate our online events. Please subscribe to our channel to find out about upcoming events. We'll be doing a live Meet the Author session at this year's 2021 ACJS conference online in May, which we hope you'll join us for. At the end of the interview, you'll find information on the ACJS, and we strongly encourage you to join the association and support its mandate to deepen our understanding of the Canadian Jewish experience. You will also find information about ordering Gerald's book with a discount code from the publisher, Academic Studies Press. Now it's my pleasure to give a proper introduction to our guests. Our interviewer, Michelle Margolis Chesner, is the Norman E. Alexander Librarian for Jewish Studies at Columbia University. She is also the Vice President / President-elect of the Association for Jewish Libraries, which just awarded the catalog of the Gerald K. Stone Collection of Judaica its annual Judaica Bibliography Award for 2021, and a co-director of Footprints, Jewish Books Through Time and Space. Ms. Chesner has degrees in history, Jewish studies, and library science. Michelle, welcome to the show and thanks for doing this.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
And now to our collector of books. The son of Holocaust survivors, Gerald K. Stone joined the National Archives of Canada in 1983, where for the next 25 years, he provided expertise and leadership in improving access to archival and published material. Gerald served as director of the standards offices of both the National Archives and Library and Archives Canada before retiring in 2009. An avid collector of Jewish Canadiana, Gerald donated some 2,000 volumes of his book collection to the University of Ottawa in support of its varied Jewish Canadian Studies program. In 2009, Gerald received the Jewish Federation of Ottawa's 75th Anniversary Volunteer Award in recognition of his activities and leadership focused on the development and preservation of the Ottawa and Canadian Jewish community's documentary heritage. Gerald, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And I will be the other interviewer. In addition to serving as the co-organizer of this series of online events with Richard Menkes of the University of British Columbia, I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies at the University of Ottawa, with a research focus on North American Jewish fiction. Gerald, could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, where you come from, and what drew you to this work?
My parents were Hungarian Holocaust survivors. Via New York, they came to settle in Montreal in 1947. And I grew up in Montreal and just north of Montreal, and today what is Laval. At that time it was Labour-de-Plouffe and became Chamedy and so on. And I ended up going to both Concordia University and McGill University, where I got my master's in library studies. And as you mentioned, much of my career has been in developing archival and library descriptive standards and systems and implementing them. So, but I did begin in 1983 when I was in Ottawa working at the National Archives to collect Jewish Canadiana. And that's been an ongoing, it continues to this day, that interest.
Great, thank you. Michelle, thanks again for joining us. And now it is your turn. Fire away.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to jump right in. What was the initial spark that led you to begin collecting Judaica Europeana?
Initially, I think it was two things. You have to remember in 1983, I was a young, freshly minted librarian with a couple of years of cataloging on contracts and term positions under my belt. I just got a permanent job at the National Archives. I wasn't yet married. I didn't have a wife. I didn't have children. I didn't have a house. I didn't even have a car. So I had a lot of time. And I think the initial two things, I joined the Ottawa Book Collectors. And that was very interesting because we ended up going to different libraries, had kind of behind the scenes tours of the Library of Parliament and in the conservation labs of the National Library of Canada and so on. And I would listen once a month to these meetings where we got together and mostly older men talk about their book collections. And I thought, well, what should I collect? And that's how it started. I thought, well, I am Jewish, I am Canadian. I should collect something about Jewish Canadiana that might, and I had two aims really. One was to keep me busy, and the second one I thought would be to learn something about Jewish Canadian history. So I think I succeeded in the first. It has kept me busy. Whether I have learned so much about Jewish Canadian history is debatable. So that was the beginning. But as I collected over many years, it's now been over 35 years, that the purposes have changed. So I've learned not only about the Jews in Canada, but also about myself and my family, a personal history.
Thank you. It sounds like you have actually learned quite a bit. What in your definition classifies a book as Canadian Judaica? Does it have to be printed in Canada? Does it have to be produced by a Jew? What are your sort of broad parameters for this subject?
Well, I prefer to use the term Jewish Canadiana. And so typically, just like we would call Judaica Americana or Jewish Americana, it tends to be books by or about the Jewish Canadian experience, works that are about Jewish history or religion or culture, arts, and so on in Canada, or by Jewish Canadians. It's not at all essential for a book to be published in Canada. Many, and I think that's important. In fact, going through this publication, what became particularly more evident to me more recently is the interest outside of Canada in Canadian studies, more broadly, but also in Canadian Jewish studies. So you find people doing degrees and research in A.M. Klein or Leonard Cohen and so on in countries around the world. And so it really is a shrinking global village. People, rabbis, artists, people of all kinds of profession may have spent time in Canada, but are no longer here, but for the period that they were here, are of interest to me. And I feel fall within the spectrum of Jewish Canadiana. just the other comment I'll make about it is that I tend to use a very broad interpretation, and I don't limit myself exclusively. It's primarily printed material, library material, but also more recently electronic resources. But also I can show you occasionally I will have artifacts, what you would think of more as museological. But here's, for example, some silverware from Judah George Joseph, one of the earliest Jewish residents of Toronto, but also one of the earliest silversmiths, Jewish silversmiths in Canada. So, and that comes from about 1840s. So those are, when I come across things like that, they're represented in the catalog. They're a minority, but nonetheless, to me, that's Canadian Judaica.
Throughout the work, both you and Richard Menkes describe the book as a catalog, as distinct from a bibliography. The subtitle of the book itself uses the phrase bibliographical resource. Could you speak about your choice of words here and the importance of these distinctions that you made?
I'm so glad you asked that question, because I think for many of the viewers, they will view this as a bibliography, and it's hard not to fault them for that. From my perspective, it's a catalog because it is an actual collection. Everything in this volume, I have actually physically collected. I don't necessarily have all of those things today. As Jesse mentioned, in 2009, I donated over 2,000 volumes to the University of Ottawa Library in support of the VERA Jewish Canadian Studies program that had been established there a few years earlier. So it is a catalog of an existing collection. And it's important to remember that there is a lot of effort that goes into assembling, acquiring material, locating it, finding it, and even before you begin to describe it. So the bibliography is a listing of material within the parameters, but it's not necessarily that it is a specific collection. It's not even necessary that those items exist anymore.
I appreciate that. This is something we think about in the Footprints project that I work on, where we're dealing with both what we call historical copies. We have a reference to something that existed in the past, but we have no idea where it might be today, versus something where we know that it's sitting in a library in New York or Ottawa or anywhere. So that's an important distinction. Thank you. As a librarian collecting digital and physical material, I was excited to see digital collections as part of your intentional collecting and also cataloging plan. I especially appreciated your identification of how much storage space was used by a particular digital resource, because as we know within the library world, bytes also take up space, even though it's not necessarily space you can see. Could you talk about your decision to collect digital material and the kinds of digital material that you collect?
There have been times during my collecting, where I felt I challenged myself. One of those times was when I began collecting Yiddish materials, Yiddish and Hebrew, because I don't speak or read Yiddish. Extremely painfully slow, but it was important to do so, and this collection and catalog is all the much more better for that. After I donated 70 boxes of books to the University of Ottawa in 2009, I was still interested in collecting but not necessarily in replicating thousands of physical volumes. I didn't have the space, I had moved. So I started to download out of the National Yiddish Book Center's digitization of Yiddish volumes through the courtesy of what's his name, the great filmmaker.
Steven Spielberg.
Exactly, thank you. Some Yiddish titles that I didn't have to fill in. But once I started that, I realized that there is so much on the internet and accessible that over these last several years, really from 2012 to the present, I was able to download and organize and describe. In here, there's about half of the volume is the electronic resources, as I say, about 3,000 described works. So, and going back from digital reproductions of things in the 19th century, or in some cases earlier, right up to things that are born digital, that don't exist in a traditional paper format. So, and that's important to me because we think how important ephemera are, posters, postcards, and so on, that are today perhaps unique. But we don't tend to think of things on the internet in that way. We think, well, we found it there, it's going to be there forever. And that's far from the truth. When you have a URL and you go and you find that 404 that the resource is no longer found, it became clear to me that electronic resources could be, if not even as much, perhaps even more so, ephemeral, and hence important to preserve. Preserving them in the digital, I made the decision to actually describe them as a physical file. So all of those things which I downloaded form a personal digital library. And so they're described as physical files. And that's, I think, in terms of bibliography, certainly in Jewish Canadian bibliography, novel. It's a contribution.
I would say in Jewish bibliography, broadly writ, this was fantastic.
Yes, and that comes out of my expertise and experience at developing the Canadian National Archival Descriptive Standard, the Rules for Archival Description, or RAD, where we had an integrated approach to describing material. And if you see the electronic records, I worked out where we describe the characteristics that are unique to a digital material, but also preserve those aspects that are relate to the printed material. So it has a digital extent in kilobytes or megabytes, but also how many pages, or the duration for sound or audio recording.
It's really incredible, and I think groundbreaking as far as bibliographies go. And sort of as a follow-up, what are there preservation plans in place? I mean, the digital is so scary to librarians because of exactly what you described. I mean, there's talk of a new dark age once we can't access this digital material anymore. And there have been some quite a few initiatives for preserving digital materials. I just wonder if you've given thought to that, or if you've put anything in place as far as how to provide access for the future to these materials.
Yeah, that's a difficult question, Michelle. Librarians and archivists are grappling with that, and there are no easy or their expensive efforts to
Yeah.
make trusted digital repositories. That is a huge issue.
Maybe a bit of a lighter question. What is the oldest, I'm not going to say book, item in your collection now that we saw the silverware?
Well, the oldest is, let me try and find that quickly. It's Thaddeus McCarty's. It's a small volume, 39 pages. The advice of Joab to the host of Israel going forth to war, considered and urged in two discourses delivered at Worcester, April 5th, 1759, being the day of the public annual fast appointed by authority and the day preceding the general muster of the militia throughout the province for the enlisting soldiers for the intended expedition against Canada, printed in Boston in 1759. And so that actually I have in digital form. It's accessible and was reproduced from a copy held by the Seminary of Quebec Library. But I actually located a quite an imperfect copy, but it's a physical copy of that. So that's the earliest thing, dating from 1759. And I think I mentioned that because it speaks to the purposes for which I collect. Some things are collected for informational purposes. And I think a lot of libraries, as well as researchers, use books and printed material documents for information, but they also have other value, evidence, association, artifactual value. So this is an excellent example. If you want just the information, you have a digital copy accessible through the Canadian Institute for Historical Micro-Reproductions, but that actual dog-eared imperfect copy is nonetheless coming from 1759, an artifactual, almost a museological specimen of that item.
Richard Menkes's preface hints at a number of interesting stories around the collecting itself that you do. I wonder if you could share with us a particularly memorable acquisition or how you were able to track down something that maybe had an interesting story.
Well, this is the book, the cover of the book. Now, I was in, I think it was in 1992, I was in Montreal, just walking up. I wasn't living in Montreal at the time. I was living in Ottawa, but I had come to visit, probably I came to visit my parents, but typically, whenever I did, I would make an effort to go to the Jewish Public Library and see what they had in their, book trucks or whatever that they didn't need and were offering for sale to the public. And I would go to bookstores and so on. I was walking up a street and ended up talking to someone just out of the blue. He asked me, "Am I Jewish?" I said yes, and we got to talking a little bit more, and it came out that I collect Jewish Canadiana. And he said, "Do I know Alan Raymond?" And I said, "No." He said, "Oh, well, Alan Raymond collects all this kind of stuff, and he has an open house today. He's trying to sell or get rid of a lot of this stuff." And I said, "Wow, that's fascinating. I'd be interested to go there." And it was already in the afternoon, so I got his address. I walked over, or whatever, I went over, go up to his apartment, and it was already quite picked over. But there I found a drawing. This drawing, it was in a terrible cheap frame, But, you know, I thought that was an interesting drawing, given that he's a book collector and I'm a book collector. And so I also picked up, you know, 6 or 7 other books, and I didn't even know who he was. There were several people in his apartment, and I saw 2 men talking, and finally I asked, how much is this? And he told me what that was. And so that's how I acquired that. And then when the publisher, once the manuscript was well in its way of being produced, and the work shifted to the cover, and I was asked if I had any ideas, I said, well, I have this item of a book, and that might well work well. And I made you know, photographed it, and so that's the
Yeah, thank you. I love that image. So here's the question that I don't like being asked when I'm being interviewed about the collection that I curate, but because I'm the interviewer, I'm gonna ask you the question, which is, what is your favorite item in the collection? And I'll qualify it with "at the moment," because that's usually how I end up answering the question, but you can answer how you wish.
That is a difficult question, because there are so many favorites. And I come back to something I mentioned earlier, that there are different purposes for which I've collected books, some from association, some for information, some purely for pleasure. So I have many fond memories of reading something for nothing to my children when they were young, a great deal of pleasurable memories around that. But I will show you one book. This is a volume of the names of Hungarian Jewish women in the Stutthof concentration camp, that actually they were transferred from Auschwitz to Stutthof. Yes, Jewish women in the Stutthof concentration camp. It is hundreds and hundreds of pages, and all it is are lists of names.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
The name, where their birth date, their place of birth, and usually a mother's name if they had it available. And there, on page 495, is my mother's name, Vera Schwartz, Kishvarda 270606, and her mom's name and the number. Now, to me, this book is so special because there's 15,000 names of Jewish women, girls and women in here. As Jews, and everybody, how do you wrap your head around 6 million who perished? It's very difficult it just is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
When I found that, my mom, and then I said, this is 15,000. There would have to be 400 volumes to make 6 million. And I think how lucky my mom was that she is probably one of the few survivors. They went back. They survived not only Auschwitz, first the ghettos, then Auschwitz, then Stutthof, which was also a killing camp, and then from there, death marches, and yet still be able to immigrate, marry, raise a family, live a productive life, have 10 grandchildren. When you multiply that, how much, that's what is, this volume brought home to me, what is the staggering loss from the Holocaust? You know, not only countering the Holocaust denial, but the generations that beyond the 6 million. Yeah. So that has special significance to me.
That's incredibly powerful. Thank you. So as my final question, and maybe one of the most important questions is, what do you see as the central importance of the work you've done in compiling this massive bibliography?
I would say there are two things. One, first of all, not specific to the bibliography, but to the collection. I feel that I have been able to preserve and bring together thousands of volumes that are extremely rare. In some cases, many are not, but some are extremely rare, and some may, and so that they are actually now accessible. I think, as we've spoken before, the ability to have integrated traditional and electronic resources is extremely important. So you use the word model, and I so appreciate that, because I hope that this volume is not only informative, but instructive, that it models, as you say, a way, an approach to include digital resources, electronic resources. And, you know, the last major bibliography of Jewish Canadian Studies was published by the Association of Canadian Jewish Studies in 2000, but it mentioned that it did not include electronic resources nor literature. And so in this publication, both are included very extensively: literature, Yiddish, English, French, Jewish, as well as digital resources in a broad gamut, from arts, legal and legislative materials, and right across a broad swath of disciplines.
Wow, I mean, it's truly an example of the sum being exponentially greater than its parts. There's so many, you know, as you said, some items are very little cost or even free, but when brought together in this very large corpus, you have something really incredible for the research of Canadian Jewry. So thank you.
Thank you so much for those questions, Michelle. That was great. Can you say why this volume won the award from your association? Like, what were the special qualities that led it to stand above others in that category?
I'm not on the committee. I don't know what their deliberations were. Okay. My thinking, just in looking at the bibliography, is the breadth and depth of the bibliography. So many of the items have descriptions that are clear, and you can understand why they were included. There's a great index at the back that gives all sorts of subjects. It's easy enough to work through because it's already cataloged. Because it uses this LSR system, you can search by subject if you know LSR, and you can then find the books more readily. So I think it updated the sources that had been available in the past, so that, like I said earlier, somebody now could really do a comprehensive study of Canadian Jewish history as evidenced in this collection in a really broad way. Again, I don't know who the other who the competition was. But I have to say that looking through this, I see that it's really an incredible resource, and so well deserving. I think the digital piece as well. I keep bringing it up because it's so unique and something that we grapple with so much. I think the decision not to use URLs was a wise one because they change so often. And it's a real concern because URLs are cited now in dissertations and publications, and then you go to the URL 2 years later and it's gone. And so I think using the files was a really good answer to that. It doesn't give you databases and things like that in that way because of that choice, but it's a more stable way to access these materials that otherwise, again, is completely ephemeral and would disappear.
As a non-librarian, I find both of your perspectives really interesting. So this has been really fun. Gerald, just one last quick question. What's next for you? What's your next project?
I mentioned that I just moved recently in February to Florida from Canada. With few exceptions, my collection is all still boxed up and in storage. I'm interested in making my collection accessible. It's partly why I agreed to donate 2,000 volumes to the University of Ottawa when they were starting up a Jewish Canadian Studies program. Ironically, I'm now a book collector that doesn't even have in this household a single bookcase. So I would like in the coming months to unbox and organize my collection and to seek to place those materials in appropriate institutions. Before I left Canada, I felt that I made a selection of about 70 items that I felt belonged in Canada, and more specifically at the National Library. And I've been successful in transferring ownership of them to Library and Archives Canada, where they can benefit and have researchers can benefit from the access they have to them. So, I can't take these things with me when I go. Nobody can. And I've seen too often where book collectors, their collections are not appreciated by their children or whatever, and I don't want it dissipated that way. So if I can find appropriate homes for these materials, that will be one of my preoccupations, and certainly to get back to doing artwork.
Great. Gerald, this has been wonderful. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
And Michelle, thanks so much for taking the time to be our guest interviewer.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you.
And I am Jesse Toufexis. Please keep watching so you can find out information about joining the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies and to get ordering information and a discount code for the catalog of the Gerald K. Collection of Judaica. Stay safe.